Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 355. And this time I'm going to talk about not just one, but four LPs, all from the series Shelly Manne and His Men at the Black Hawk, which came out in 1960 on Contemporary Records. What I've got is uh, three US stereo releases. Sorry, there's number two and number three, and then a fourth volume, which is the first UK original. The US original volume 4 is very rare indeed. I got tired of waiting for it, which is why I ended up picking up the UK version. If you want to pick up an original set, it'll cost you probably, I would say, at least 400 US, probably more, to gather the set. Thankfully, there are plenty of later issues which sound pretty good, and there was in fact also a 5 CD set which comes out in 2010, which comprises all of this plus some unreleased tracks as well. Shelly Manne is one of the most recorded drummers in jazz. He has something like 1,500 recording credits, although it's kind of hard to come up with an exact total. He's an inventive and an often very witty player, but distinct from some of his contemporaries like Art Blakey or Kenny Clarke, he's not a bomb dropper. His solos are very rare, and like the piano player Horace Silver, he basically makes any combo he's playing with tighter and he allows them to swing harder. The years of his greatest work, arguably the later 1950s, are also his most prolific. They include these four records, which are drawn from a 2-week engagement at a jazz club in San Francisco, and I think collectively are some of the greatest small group jazz recordings ever made live. Shelly Manne, whose given name was Sheldon, was born in New York in June 1920. His dad and his uncles were all drummers. His other early role models were people in the big bands, people like Joe Jones, who drummed for Basie. By his later teens, he got some gigs, amazingly enough, drumming on transatlantic ocean liners going from London to New York and back. In 1940, he was hired into Bobby Burns' big band, and that's where he records for the first time. And during the war, he records on and off with some fairly big names, people like Coleman Hawkins and Oscar Pettiford, but his musical ventures were somewhat abbreviated by the fact that he was also in the Coast Guard between 1942 and 1945. When he was on leave, he would still play in 52nd Street, even though he was quite young. His outgoing personality and his general flexibility made him a real favorite on the scene for people trying to book a drummer. He ended up marrying one of the Rockettes, a girl called Florence Butterfield, otherwise known as Flip. When bebop arrived in 1944-45, Shelly Manne was an early adopter, and he was very close to the heart of the action. In fact, those are his drums that you can hear on Dizzy Gillespie's first recording of Salted Peanuts. And through the rest of the 1940s, he continued to work and record with the beboppers, but not exclusively. One day he might be working with Dizzy Gillespie, the next day with somebody more traditional like Oscar Pettiford. He could basically play anything with anybody, and as a consequence of this flexibility, he becomes a first call session guy, which was a status he pretty much enjoyed throughout his whole career. Between 1945 and 1950, he also got a lot of work playing with some of the better known big bands, those led by Woody Herman and in particular Stan Kenton. For Manne, this exposure basically turned him into a star, and he was winning downbeat polls and all the rest of it. By the early 50s, however, New York was losing its appeal for Shelly Manne. This was for a couple of reasons. He wasn't that keen about the drug scene that really was taking off. And on top of that, he and his wife both wanted a more rural lifestyle. In particular, they liked horses and they wanted to raise horses. So in 1952, they head out to LA and they buy themselves a little ranch in the San Fernando Valley, and they start to breed horses, at which apparently they did quite well. However, Shelly, of course, also becomes a major figure almost instantly on the local jazz scene, given his profile, and arguably in the next couple of decades becomes the most prominent and active jazz musician in California. Almost as soon as he arrived, he joins up with Howard Rumsey's Lighthouse All-Stars, which Rumsey was just reconstituting. In fact, he's on the very first recordings made by the All-Stars, and he soon signs an exclusive recording contract with Les Koenig of Contemporary. And from that point on, at least until the whole mainstream jazz scene begins to falter in the mid-1960s, Shelly Manne could do no wrong. He led his own groups, he drummed on hundreds and hundreds of sessions, he was a major contributor to TV and movie soundtracks. He became, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most recorded drummers in history. He was central to the emergence of the whole West Coast jazz scene, but he was also, I think, able to make the kind of contribution which showed that it was not this sort of bloodless academic exercise that some of the East Coast critics said that it was. And in particular, you could point to the work he did with Sonny Rollins and Rollins' 2 records that he did for Contemporary. He was open to experimental work. He was on Ornette Coleman's second record, Something Else, for Contemporary. And he also puts out his own avant-garde jazz or avant-garde adjacent jazz, the stuff he did with Jimmy Giuffre. But swinging, straight-ahead jazz was always his sweet spot. It's generally felt, and I agree, that his greatest work was done on Contemporary between 1952 and 1962. In this period, he releases more than 20 albums as a leader. He's on countless sessions, His trio work with the pianist Andre Previn and either Leroy Vinegar or Red Mitchell on bass remains greatly underappreciated and still pretty inexpensive. Ditto the 4 records he did with Ray Brown and Barney Kessel under the name Pole Winners. His work as a leader in the 1950s and 1960s was commonly done under the name Shelly Manne and His Men, a group with a regularly changing landscape. He had his pick of some of the best sidemen in LA. This includes people like Joe Mondragon, Curtis Counts, Russ Freeman, Bud Shank, Herb Geller, Conte Candioli, and Jimmy Giuffre. He typically preferred a quintet, and arguably the best of these coalesced in and around early 1959. That version includes Monty Budwig on bass, Russ Freeman on piano, Joe Gordon on trumpet, and Richie Kamuka on tenor, and it's that quintet, or a version of it, which makes these 4 records. Shelly Manne's group was booked into the Black Hawk, perhaps at the time San Francisco's best-known jazz club, but now sadly deceased, for 2 weeks in the middle of September 1959. There was an alteration required to the usual lineup because Russ Freeman, the piano player, had gone with Benny Goodman to Europe for 6 weeks. So in comes Victor Feldman, the English multi-instrumentalist who had made such a splash in LA since he'd arrived from London really not that long before. On tenor, Richie Kamuka is a guy from Philadelphia. He, like Mann, had been a veteran of both the Kenton and Herman big bands. Joe Gordon, a real star on trumpet, had cut his teeth in Boston in the mid-1950s. He'd recorded as a leader there as well. He'd left some troubles behind him and come out to the West Coast in 1958 and joined up with Mann pretty soon after. And on bass was Monty Budwig, by this point a very well-established session player in LA, and he'd been playing pretty consistently with Mann since 1957. The band agreed that the chemistry of the new lineup, combined with the setting, was creating something that really ought to be recorded. So Mann phones up Les Koenig, the owner of Contemporary, and says, look, can you bring up an engineer and all the gear? Koenig agrees. He and the engineer Howard Holter come up the very next day, and the nights of the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th September are recorded in their entirety, and what Holter manages to capture is magnificent in its intimacy. So much so that it altered the release plans for the material. They'd originally planned just to put 1 record out. They heard the tapes, and both Mann and Koenig decide that this has to be put out pretty much in its entirety, resulting in 4 LPs. I won't go through all 16 tracks. There isn't the time, and some of them are kind of end of set band outros. Most of the tracks are fairly extended 10-minute plus workouts, and here, to my mind, are the highlights. Record 1, side 1, track 1, the opener, Summertime, is just glorious. Make sure that you have at least 2 fingers of single malt available for this one. It's an early introduction to the talents of the ill-fated Joe Gordon, and Richie Kamuka, really, I think, underappreciated tenor sax player, just slays on here. That first record also has a unique version of Poinciana. If you're used to the Ahmad Jamal treatment, think of something, well, certainly the head arrangement anyway, about 4 times the speed, and once they settle in, it swings like a freight train. On record 2, we have the first of 2 excellent Benny Golson covers. This is Step Lightly, and with the greatest of respect to Golson's recordings of his own material, which are great, this, to my mind, is a definitive version of this song. The third record is probably the most consistent of the 4 records. It contains Cole Porter's I Am in Love, which is a setting for Kamuka's tenor to shine again, and it also has the other Golson cover, Whisper Not, which is similarly spectacular, and special mention here for Gordon's mute work. Record 4, to my mind, lacks a real standout track, but it's still full of high caliber hard bop. How do these records make me feel? Well, let's imagine you recommended a jazz club to your friends and you walked into the club with them, and the music that's playing is just sublime and super swinging, and you know and everybody else knows that you have just nailed it with this recommendation. That's how this music feels. It is just that sweet spot, the dart right in the bullseye of jazz. Being an obsessive and a contemporary obsessive of that, I had to gather all 4, but you don't have to do that. The best records are probably number 1 and number 3, and the weakest is probably number 4, but the standard, even for number 4, is still very high. The recordings and the performances aren't perfect, but in terms of that feeling of being immersed, being there at a classic club in a great era of music, feeling like you're sitting just feet from the stage, these records are right up there with Bill Evans' Village Vanguard sessions. They contain some of the finest moments in Shelly Manne's whole career as a leader, and for me, as a group, I give these records 4.5 out of 5 stars.